CIR acknowledges that we all live in the beautiful, unceded homeland of the Chumash people. CIR seeks to honor the original inhabitants of this land, which is what I put in all the time. But boy, do we have a chance to really honor the original inhabitants of this land tonight, because I'm going to turn this over to James Yee, who has been studying this language now for years and has had it in his family, and he'll tell you about what he's doing to revive this language. James, over to you.
And thank you very much for a great introduction. And thank you for your friendship with our community, which is actually the reason why I'm here tonight.
Yes.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen share?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, great. Welcome to an introduction to the Barbaringo Chumash language. Haku haku, kakti James Yee. Kiaka ikas shishkuka hi it il shupokia nut na. So welcome, or hello. My name is James Yee. Sorry, the cat is chiming in a little. Truly, we are the people of this land. No kakina liyu. It means thank you very much. And especially thank you to the ancestors who passed down this ancient and beloved language of ours through countless generations and hundreds and thousands of years. And these also include my ancestors from villages in the upper Santa Ynez River watershed: Siguaya, Sakaya, Shniwak, Miasap, Stuk, the village at Dos Pueblos, Miku, the political capital on the beach at present-day Cabrillo Boulevard, Siucton, and the villages where our people lived in the modern historical period, Kaswa and Alkaash. So I recognize all of the ancestors. A little bit about me, as Ken mentioned, I was born in Santa Barbara, raised in Goleta. After graduating from Bishop Diego High School, I joined the Army and spent some years in Germany with the 1st Armored Division there. I did undergraduate studies at the University of Hawaii. As Ken mentioned, I lived in Tokyo and Yokohama, Japan. I was a teacher of English as a foreign language. I came back here about 10 years ago. For the first time in my life, I became involved with our local tribal activities. In 2017, naively thinking it would be easy, I started a language class in our community. This is our specific community of which I'm a member. So that was in 2017, when I didn't know, I think I knew about 5 words in the language. And then in 2019, as Ken mentioned, I entered the Graduate Department of Linguistics at UCSB, where I'm about to start my 5th year. There's 2 points I'd like to bring up at the start of this presentation. The first is the issue of names. So the name of the presentation is An Introduction to the Barbaringo Chumash Language. You might or might not be aware that the word Chumash was originally applied to the group of languages in the Chumash, in the homelands of the people who lived in this area, by John Wesley Powell in the 1890s, when he was compiling the classification of native languages. That Chumash name was picked up by Alfred Kroeber of the University of California. So the word Chumash is an exonym. It's a name for a language used by outsiders. It's also used by people in our community as well. So it's a little bit different from these kind of dictionary definitions that you see on screen. An endonym is a name for a language used by speakers of that language. So I prefer to use the name for the language of Alap Kaswa. Kaswa is the village where our reservation was located. So associating the language with the people who lived in that village on the reservation, it's very, very comfortable for me. Another word for our language is Akiakli, our language. A lot of Native groups in California often refer to themselves as the people or our language. So they didn't have a special name for those. Another point I wanted to mention is that the perspective from which I tell this story is really important. So this is my personal, individual perspective, particular to me as an individual at this time in my journey of learning about the language. I'm also a member of a family within a particular community. So my perspective is not representative of all Chumash people everywhere. Parts of the story I'll tell today. So I'll introduce some features of the language. I'll talk about how the language arrived at its present condition. I'll tell about the three grandmothers, and finally talk a little bit about revitalizing the language. I'd like to start with a quote from a speaker of the Selkup language, Narim dialect, and this is, her name is Polina Shulbayeva. So she's a speaker of this language. It's actually in Siberia, in Russia. It's an indigenous language. But I really like this quote because it really explains the link between language and land and the people who live on the land and speak the language. So here's the quote: "A language tells who you are. It is connected with your culture, with your lands, with your family." So my presentation is somewhat different, I think, than the regular presentations that you might see on this Channel Islands Restoration web series. But I hope that you get from this presentation the deep sense of connection between language and land and the people who lived on and who still do live on the land. California, especially this part of California, is such a beautiful area. It has really stunning beauty. But that's only, even in spite of that really, really stunning beauty of this area, it's really only touching the surface, because underneath that, there's a very, very long history of the people who lived here and speak in a particular language. It's something that I'm only beginning to touch in my short 6 years of studying this language. But I hope you get a sense of how special the connection is between language and land and people and culture. I often conceptualize Alap Kaswa, our language, as a basket. The Chumash were very famous for their weaving these beautiful baskets, and we still have basket weavers in our community, like my cousin, Samantha Sandoval. So the basket of language, and this is not an original idea by me or unique idea. Other people have this, hold this idea as well for their respective languages. But for me, the basket that is the Alap Kaswa language is the basket that holds the hopes and dreams and history and stories of the people. And for a long time, this basket has been, for a long time, it was beautiful and pristine, and it occupied the center of the community. For the last few hundred years, it's really been beat up and scuffed and kicked around and thrown into a corner. And now we are bringing it back into its rightful place in the center of our community. So this is really important for me. And thank you to Lorianne for providing this picture of this beautiful basket. So I'd like to introduce some features of the language. One of the first things is that the Chumash languages are language family isolate, which means they're not related genetically speaking to any other known languages or language family. This is pretty rare, especially considering the great linguistic diversity of California. There's something like 18 language families and over 70 individual languages. So even among this great diversity among indigenous California languages, there are very few that are language isolates. And it says something about how special this language is to me. Of course, each language is special in its own right. It also says something about how the people arrived to this particular land. For example, did they come overland, gradually drifting or walking, perhaps overland, or did they come by boat, perhaps touching different places where they were investigating or looking for places where they might live? And of course, they chose the best area to live, on prejudice, of course. But there is some work being done, I think archaeological work on this connection or how the people arrived here. Another feature of the language, the Chumash language family, is there are at least 6 languages divided into 2 major branches. Some people are surprised when they hear this. They think of the Chumash people and Chumash languages as these monolithic groups. Everyone's the same across the whole territory. But there are at least 6 languages that come down to us. I wonder if there were more in the period before the Spanish arrived, divided into 2 major branches. So the Northern Chumash, comprised of the Obispeño, the Tilhini language, Southern Chumash, the Central Chumash branch, Purismeño, Inaseño, Ventureño, Barbareño, and then Island Chumash, also known as Cruzeño. Of course, these labels for the language come from the missions around which these languages spoken around the missions became the name for the languages. And this is from the linguistic perspective. Okay, so it's a language isolate, has at least 6 languages. And here's a map showing the different in general, the language territories or the lands which they occupy. You can see the Barbareño here along the coast. I told you at the beginning of the presentation that some of my ancestors came from the upper Santa Ynez River watershed. So this area here, in which I believe the Alapkaswa was also spoken in these areas as well. And you might be wondering, how old are the Chumash languages? From the archaeological record, well, they tell us, well, there's 13,000 years. Human remains found on Huitma, Santa Rosa Island, date to 13,000 years ago, matching the oldest human remains found in North America. This is the archaeological story. We also tell stories of how long we've been here, although of course we don't give the exact dates, but we do tell at least once in one story, at least, there's a story passed down that used to be told at the Santa Barbara mission that the people started, so all of the people on the mainland here started at the islands and then came drifting like fog across the water to their respective villages here. So that's a very old story that does tell how the people came to these villages here on the mainland. So this question, how old are the languages, will be, it's hard to answer, because even if you do linguistic analysis, once you get to a certain time depth of several thousand years old, it's not really possible to, with the techniques we have now, to delve further into how old the language is, but you can expect that they're quite old. One of the things I'd like to introduce when I talk about the language is the number system. It's a very interesting number system. We, of course, are used to the decimal system based on the number 10. And some of you might know, I think there's 160 people about here. So some of you might know what kind of numbering system it is. Sorry, I had a recording, but it's not cooperating right now. But just looking at this in the comfort of your own home with your family and friends, can you figure out what kind of number system it is? And your hint, of course, is that it's not a decimal system. So I won't ask all of you to shout out the answer. You're probably on mute anyways. Okay, any guesses? Did you figure it out? Okay, sorry, it started playing, but I don't think you could hear that. Is that correct, Ken?
Yeah,
No,
we could
can't
hear you.
that.
Oh, you can hear
We
that?
can hear you, but we can't hear the recording.
Okay, I won't even play it then. Thank you. It went on. I think I touched it with the mouse. Okay, so actually, if you look at these numbers, so baka, ishkom, masik, skukmu, you can see that at least the first three are repeated here. Yeti baka, yeti shkom, yeti masik. And then even number 12, masik eskumu. It looks like it would be 3 times 4. This is actually, if you guessed a number system based on the number 4, you would be correct. It's a quaternary system. I'm sure you figured that out. And then, of course, the next question is, why would it be a number 4 system? Is it based on the 4 directions, possibly? Is it based on the 4 seasons, even though we don't really have a very, very distinguishable 4 seasons like other places? Maybe it's based on the 4 gaps between the fingers of your hand. We're not sure, actually, but it is a quaternary system showing the how different and unique these languages are. You might be thinking about words in the language, and maybe you'd like, although this is not a language lesson per se, you might be thinking that you would like to use the language. I believe that, yeah, it's great to use the language. And here's some of the words that we use in our community, and you can use them as well. I encourage you to do as well. So haku, haku is a greeting, hello or hello, hello. We have a leave-taking formula. Kiwatnan, kiwatnan, I go for a short time. And just a point about the different sounds in the language. Some of the sounds, or actually the orthography, so the letters represented by, or the sounds represented by letters, we use mostly the Roman alphabet, and with a little mix of American phonetic notation. This little apostrophe represents a glottal stop. So when you make this sound, you cut off the airflow in your vocal tract. Similar to the sound, the famous example is when we say, when we spill the water or spill the milk, we say, uh-oh. So that little catch, stopping of air, is a glottal stop. So kiwatnan. That's a feature of the sound of the language. Here's another word you might want to use, bear. The word for it is hus, hus. So that's a sound similar to like when you say the letter like, for example, cat, cat, that k sound. And if you make it k, make it kind of continue the sound. So hus, hus means bear. And one more I threw in just before this presentation. This took me a long time to find. I kept looking for this. I finally found it. I love you. Important words to say. Kakshwalawin. Kakshwalawin. I'm sorry. It should be kakshwalawin. Kakshwalawin. The accent comes on the penultimate syllable, typically in this language. The penultimate syllable is the second to the last syllable. So kakshwalawin, kakshwalawin. Okay, that's hard to say, but I hope you use these words, some assorted words in the language. Next, continuing with introducing features of the language, I'd like to talk a little bit about syntax, how the words fit together with each other, a little bit about morphology as well, the different grammatical aspects of the language. When we're looking at the documented language, so the historical notes that linguists have written down based on conversation with speakers of the language, in this case, it was my grandmother, Mary Yee, and the linguist was Madison Beeler, linguist with the University of California at Berkeley. He worked with my grandmother in the 1950s. So here's a typical sentence that we would see in the language documentation. Wow, what could that possibly mean? So this is an introduction to the language for you. It's very effective to first figure out what is the verb in the language. And we can say the verb is akmil. That's another sound in which it's articulated very, very far in the back of your throat. Akmil. In this language, there's quite a lot of prefixes used. So additions attached to the verb. There's also suffixes, things that come after the verb that attach to the verb, but there's many, many prefixes. So here they're showing two. What is this first one, the k? Of course, it means I. So I. And what is this sa? It looks like another prefix. Oh, it's referring to the future. So will. So I will drink. And then we have some parts over here, not part of the verb. So not part of the main part of the sentence, but added on. This he, it's called linguists call it a dependent marker. In this alapkaswa, additional information is introduced with he. So you can give the main verb, and which basically tells the action that's occurring. And then with he, you can introduce additional information in the sentence. So this has a dependent marker, he. It has an article. Oh, an article's like a or the in English, very similar. So hil. And what is this word right here? It looks super short. It has a glottal stop, an O, and another glottal stop. Water. Oh, okay. So hil o. It could be and actually look at this word water. So linguists know that the more you use a word, the shorter it becomes. It takes a long time. So imagine how many times this word, something as basic as water, how many times over hundreds or who knows how many years it was used to come down to this super short word, oh. And this, of course, is different from in French. That's probably a different pronunciation as well, E-A-U. Okay, so put it all together. I will drink water. I am going to drink water. And because we were focused on the words, we totally missed the tahama, which is a skunk, tahama, at the bottom. So you can see what he's doing as the words fill in. Okay, I make my own slides. I had to introduce that to you. I will drink water. I'm going to drink water. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about the language in its present condition, how it's come down to us today, and the condition of the language in which we encounter the language now. So this is a short history of the history of the people after contact with Europeans. So we know from our history lessons that 1542 marked the first time that that we know about that Europeans encountered Chumash peoples here in the Santa Barbara Channel. There might have been other contacts that we don't know about. For example, maybe a ship blown off course or something like that. In 1769, the Portola expedition came overland from Mexico on the way to San Francisco Bay, and that was when the Spanish began permanent settlement in this area. In 1786, Mission Santa Barbara was established. The people began to gather there. A short time later, not very long later, in the 1830s, control of the mission system passed to the Mexican government. Of course, we know this as secularization. And this was a time when many community members moved to our reservation. Our reservation, our former reservation, was at the present-day corner of Modoc Road and Hollister Avenue. So very close to where the railroad tracks cross, I guess it's still Hollister Avenue, in that general area. In the 1880s, the last of our reservation residents were evicted from their homes. So the story is that it's been passed down to us is that the federal government of the United States assigned an Indian agent to take care of the people. There was a lot going on in that period of time. That was already in the 1880s, during the American period, and the kind of the edges of the reservation were constantly being encroached upon. So the Indian agent was supposed to take care of the people. He gained outright title to different plots of land of reservation residents. Reservation residents also gave power of attorney powers to him. So with the promise that he would take care of the residents, which he did mostly, not always. He died suddenly. His widow sold the land to the Southern Pacific Railroad for $250,000, $250,000. And that's why the railroad goes right through that section. It goes right through, I believe, within the borders of our former reservation. So what happened to all of the residents after they left the reservation? And not much is known of them after this time. And that would be true for the historical record. Individual families, of course, have their family's history, such as my family, and we pass down what happened to us after we left the reservation. So at this time, over 100 years after the Spanish first came here to stay, the language was really in trouble. A lot of people had died during the mission period from disease and neglect. And now the survivors, the remnant, gathered at the reservation, where they're able to communicate in the language. Maybe I'm sure they practiced their customs, their culture. But when we lost our land, everyone dispersed and was assimilated into the surrounding communities. So the men were very good with horses. They probably worked on ranchos in the local area, even further afield in California. The women perhaps worked as domestic servants. So this was a time, and of course, when they left the reservation, they began to speak the language less and less. And this is pretty common, very painful process, but common. And when we talk about the health or vitality of languages, there's different labels we can use. We can talk about things like language shift, which I'll explain in just a moment. Endangered language, a language that is in danger of being lost, not spoken anymore. A dead language and extinct language. Although these two terms, dead and extinct languages, they do have an effect on members of indigenous communities, because when those members hear, oh, my language is dead, my language is extinct, oh, okay, so there's no hope of it coming back. So it does have an influence on how people relate to their language and how they might attempt to bring it back. We can also talk about a sleeping language or a dormant language, more like a volcano that's dormant, sleeping for now, but in the future, it has the capacity to someday wake up. So those are ways that we talk about health or vitality of languages. I'm going to focus a little bit on language shift right now. There's various definitions for this phenomenon, probably because it is so widespread. One definition, a community in contact with another culture or community, speaking one language, and then over time, gradually coming to speak another language. There's another definition by Joshua Fishman, the second one, referring to intergenerational continuity. The fact that community begins to have fewer uses and users every generation. So language is not, language is best suited, will best continue if it's passed on in the home. Within the artificial environment of classrooms and schools, it's much more difficult. So in the home, intergenerational flourishes the most. Language is passed from parents to children and on through the generations. There's a lot of causes of language shift, of course, pretty much as different as the communities in which it occurs all over the world. Of course, you can imagine that social, cultural, economic, military pressures exerted, especially exerted by dominant, powerful, influential communities on smaller, less influential, less powerful communities, has a lot to do with language shift. So consider the 1880s. Okay, so the Spanish language had been introduced. That was the influential, dominant, powerful language. And then English more and more began to be spoken as well. Languages like Alap Kaswa, what would you use it for? You couldn't really use it for business. Maybe you'd use it in the home with your family members. These were some of the pressures of language shift occurring. So there's probably many reasons for language shift in our community. These are just two out of a host of language reasons for language shift. First of all, the high mortality rate among community members during the Spanish mission period and beyond. The percentages are, some that I've seen are up to 90%. There's different figures for this. Another reason, the loss of land leading to assimilation of community members, leading to equaling fewer community members identifying as Alap Kaswa. Alap Kaswa also refers to the identity of being associated with a particular community, abandoning your culture, and we know the strong link between culture and language, loss of intergenerational, this all-important intergenerational language transmission. So it was a really serious condition for our language from the 1880s, especially. And sometimes we hear these statistics, we hear these stories, but we don't really connect them with concrete people. But I would like to, from my perspective, from my experience and the place where I come from, I'd like to talk about my great-great-great-grandmother, Maria Ignacia. She was born around 1798. She was born at the village of Siuktun, the political capital on the beach at present-day Cabrillo Boulevard. She was also actually known to be the last person alive to have been born at Siuktun. She died in 1865. She was married several times, I think 4 times. Her first husband was the son of the chief of Heliak. Heliak was the village right about where the East Gate overlooking Goleta Beach, the UCSB East Gate is on that bluff. That's the location of Heliak. For her 4th husband, I believe, she married a person who had some position of leadership in the mission community. We're not sure exactly how it happened, but he gained title to a land grant. So he was awarded a land grant probably by the Mexican government. We're not sure. The land grant was just off of Old San Marcos Pass Road. So as you travel up Old San Marcos Pass Road, you pass through the housing subdivision. You go up the hill, the road turns to the left and kind of opens out. You can see like houses and buildings down below and orchards. So that was the land where that Maria Ignacia and her family lived on. And they lived on there starting about in the 1840s. Well into the 20th century, they lived on the land, they spoke the language. It was pretty isolated, somewhat isolated. So they were able to practice their culture, tell stories every night. So the language was able to be passed down in this family of Maria Ignacia. In 1913, a linguist arrived in Santa Barbara County. And even though, so think about the situation at the time. So Maria Ignacia and my ancestors, her family, they were able to continue speaking the language. But how many other families or groups of families had land and had a really closely knit family group with which they could speak the language? It was super difficult. So the numbers of people, of language speakers, continued to decrease. In 1913, a linguist arrived in Santa Barbara County. He was here to document, which means write down, Alapkaswa. This linguist was on a mission, tearing through the Southwest and the Pacific Northwest and all over California in a race against time, trying to write the language of these rapidly disappearing languages, trying to have conversations with the first language native speakers of these languages before they died off. Sometimes he was in time, he could talk with these people. Other times he was not in time. And the last speaker of the language, the last first language speaker had passed on. This linguist, of course, was, in the comfort of your own home, you can shout out the answer, of course, John P. Harrington, linguist and ethnographer. So he was actually a graduate of Santa Barbara High School. I think he's on the Hall of Fame there. I'm not sure. I've never been there, but that's what I've heard. He heard from Alfred Kroeber from the University of Berkeley, pretty famous linguist, that there was a woman in Santa Barbara who spoke the old language, and Harrington couldn't believe it. It was around 1913 that he talked with this woman, Luisa Ignacio. So she was my great-great-grandmother. When Harrington talked to her, I'm not sure if it was 1913 or 1914, she was already in her late 70s. And here comes this man, this Caucasian man, who sat down with her on the kitchen table at 214 East Dalagara Street. I believe that's the correct number. The building's still there. I think it's a chiropractor office. And he asked her questions about old stories and people and places and traditional medicine. And she, drawing on her vast lifetime experience with the language and with life in this area, was able to supply him with tons of information about these different topics. She died in 1922. Harrington next began working with Lucrecia Ignacio Garcia, my great-grandmother. She even went to Coney Island with Harrington. She was a married woman. Because they went to Coney Island. I think they were either going to or coming from the Smithsonian Institution. Probably they called Harrington in for a meeting or something, I imagine, and he took her with so he could continue working with her, probably on the train. She died in 1937, and Harrington next worked with this lady here in this picture, Mary Yee. That's my father's mother, my grandmother. Harrington worked with her for the longest. They had a collaboration lasting, I think it was almost a decade. And finally, one of my grandmothers outlived Harrington because he died in 1961. And I believe he continued to work with my grandmother till the end. Mary Yee here is pictured with Tomas Ignacio. Tomas Ignacio was the younger brother of Lucrecia Ignacio Garcia. Younger, yes. And this this picture shows a radio interview on KTMS radio in 1949. The interview was proposed by the Museum of Natural History here in town. It really surprises me that during this time that KTMS radio would agree to have this interview and that they were interested enough to have this interview. There's 3 people in the interview. The announcer is asking Mary Yee questions in English. She translates the questions to Alap Kaswa because Tomas Ignacio could not speak English. He could only speak Alap Kaswa and Spanish. I had a clip. It doesn't, the audio's not working so well, but perhaps you can hear this clip. So the quality is pretty bad. It's from 1949. This is one of the, I don't know of any other instances. I hope there are. I'm not aware of any other instances of Alap Kaswa being spoken spontaneously by 2 fluent first language speakers. Mary Yee, she spoke Alap Kaswa exclusively until she was 12 years old and started school, and then she learned Spanish and English. So this is a really treasured recording. I'm going to play a little bit of it. Hopefully it comes out okay, but Ken will let me know if it's not coming out. So here's the radio interview from 1949.
Hola, me llamo Alfonso. He was born by the old mission.
By the old mission.
Yeah.
Which whereabouts near the old mission? I mean, on a farm near there, or whereabouts in that area?
A la misión. No, okay. Alicón, hacemos Oh, they call this Alicón, this Indian orchard where we were born.
Okay, thank you for listening. So that was a interview. I believe that was the first question of the interview. So you can see that they kind of start off slow, but then as they're talking in Alap Kaswa, they start to get really animated and start speeding up their speech. It's super interesting. So Harrington actually was very close with my family. I don't know if I'm guessing he had special relationship with all of the people he worked with because he became such a he was so interested in their language and their culture and customs. He's shown in this picture Harrington's holding my aunt, my father's younger sister Angela. Lucrecia Ignacio Garcia is in the middle. Mary Yee is holding my father. So this is in 1931. Harrington actually attended my father's wedding, my parents' wedding in 1957. There's pictures and even movie recordings. And I used to think, wow, who's that tall Caucasian man in the background? He seemed a little bit out of place, but he was close to my family. Even before he died, he had Parkinson's disease. So my grandfather, Henry Yee, would take care of Harrington, walk him back to his hotel. So the grandmothers were helped. We owe such a debt of gratitude, I personally feel, to documenting the language. And of course, there were others that Harrington had conversations with, and together they left us such a great legacy of language. Really amazing. Which brings us up to the present. When we talk about the health or vitality of languages, there are different labels we can use. One of the labels is waking up a language, so reawakening a language. Another one is revitalizing a language, infusing a language with new life. And that's what we are in this particular community, which I'm a part of, are trying to do. Language revitalization, actually, I conceive of it as bringing the ancestral language back to a place of increased use, appreciation, respect, and then passing on those values to the younger generations, really putting the language in the center of the community where I think it belongs. And around the world, of course, many indigenous communities are revitalizing their languages. Revitalizing the language also has the associated benefit of providing healing. You might ask, healing from what? But just think about the traumatic events that happened, especially in the first 100 years and even over the 200-year period of time in which the Spanish first arrived, and then one of the last first language speaker until today of Alap Kaswa passed away. The language also strengthens identity and pride in being Chumash. So these are really, really important. And we also have the word in our language, Suki Nanik Oi, which means to revive someone or something, to bring back to life. And actually, it's the name of the garden at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History, Suki Nanik Oi Garden. So you might ask, well, what's going on in your language community today? So the larger Native community here in Goleta, Santa Barbara is really fractured. I identify with the community of families who lived on a reservation in the 1800s. We have no land to call our own. There are no first language speakers, although I'm hearing hints that parents and grandparents are speaking the language with their young children. So even if there's no exclusively Alap Kaswa first language speakers, now or very soon there will be bilingual speakers, which is great. The language is not used much, but it's very, very well documented. Many community members have forgotten their native culture and identity, as I kind of did until 10 years ago. Sounds in the language seem alien and strange, like those X's or the Q's or the glottal stops. We've gotten so used to English and Spanish and these other world dominant languages that when we hear the language of this land, we think, wow, that sounds strange, but actually it's the language of this land. So I am teaching a language class. I haven't taught since December, actually. Because the program I'm in at UCSB takes a lot of time, but I'm hoping to start the language class again. I would like personally to get more younger people interested in learning the language, bringing language into the home, that all-important intergenerational continuity, make more language materials available, like publishing our stories. We have many, many stories. Training language teachers, many obstacles, as you can imagine, finding the time, very few resources, financial, definitely. I've never been paid for doing this work for the last 6 years, but it's a labor of love. Might be a cliche, but it is. And it's difficult to change hearts and minds, but that's one of the reasons I wanted to give this presentation tonight. Things in our favor, we're discovering language resources all around us, more documentation, professional help. My advisor, Professor Marianne Methuen, she's an expert in Native indigenous languages of North America. She's been super helpful for our community in many, many ways. And then interest is increasing as evidenced by the 65 about participants here tonight. So parts of the story I told today, I told about features of the language, how the language arrived at its present condition, the three grandmothers, and I talked about revitalizing the language. So I hope that as you live and work and travel on this land in the days and years and months to come, I hope that maybe you can learn about the language and learn about the culture and the people who lived on this land for thousands of years, who still are here. And maybe you can start using the language. I personally believe that the land and the animals and the birds and the insects like to hear the language that they've heard for a very long time. So I like especially the place names. These are pretty easy to learn and pretty easy to integrate into your lexicon, your vocabulary. For example, Tip Tip Shup, the Kumbra Peak, and Awat Alam, Limu, Channel Islands Restoration probably goes out here a lot. Limu, Uksh Ulo, Anisk Oyo'o, and Gwa. This shows the kind of the sense of humor, I think. So Mescalitan Island, of course, you can read, I think, there's information about this island. It's actually a sad history of what happened here. I'm reminded of it every time I drive out that east gate of UCSB. But this word, gua, can you imagine what kind of animal it's similar to? What kind of sound some animal makes? Gua. Yeah, of course, a duck. It's a kind of duck. So I'd like to finish with this quote. This is a quote from my father's baby sister, Ernestine Ignacia de Soto. It was translated, I think, in 2017 by Marianne Methuen. So here's my version of this. Napash nipit hihe iti hel shup ipwakapi hip tayash nipit aike suiliti hisiwe hiki no chwash. So as you live and work on this land, I hope you keep that in mind, definitely. And that's all. Thank you for listening. Do you have any questions for me?
Oh, there's a lot of questions.
Oh,
And they keep coming in, but I don't know that we're going to have time to get to them all. So we'll do our best. Need to probably answer these really quickly, but right off the bat, there was a good question from Anonymous. How did your time working for the U.S. military influence how you are involved with the Chumash language?
Oh, I think it gave me actually the thing that comes to mind right now is that I was so anxious to get out of this area when I was just out of high school. That being in the infantry with the 1st Armored Division, mechanized infantry, yeah, it gave me a really deep appreciation for this area. I think that's the biggest lesson, actually. Hope that answers your question. Thank you for your question.
And another Anonymous says, how do you research a language? I mean, a basic question when you were talking about researching the language. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on what your goals are for researching the language. Like, if you're an academic and you want to find out about language, I'm in Google Scholar. I spent a lot of time in libraries around town, trying to look at the different sources or what's written about the language and the people public libraries around here, I think I tapped out the resources pretty quickly. Then I went to the UCSB library, and this is just on my own time when I was working. And yeah, it's actually even 4 years into this graduate program, 6 years after beginning the language class, I'm still discovering resources. I think as you get more experience, you find exactly what you're looking for while still cognizant, aware of things that you didn't know about that will catch your interest and lead you down some, not a rabbit hole, but a different avenue of research. And I'm not sure if I answered you, but hopefully that touched on the question. Thank you.
Okay. Melody Alvarez, yay, Melody. What is being done to ensure native language preservation? So many were eradicated or close to it.
I think
So, yeah, what's being done to ensure these things get preserved?
Melody, I think one of the really important trends is that the people of these communities all over the world are taking control or reclaiming ownership of their own language materials. I think for so long that our languages have been used for purposes that didn't necessarily align with how the people in that benefited the people in the community, or that aligned with how the people in the community would like to see their language used. But I think that's one of the really big ways. And then also, Indigenous people are becoming more involved in documenting the language, taking a bigger role in the documentation. So the writing down and recording, and even the dissemination of their language. And I think those are really important steps. Thank you for your question.
Yes, and Kevin Lord says, please explain the idioms of Chumash language.
I'm sorry, what was that word in the before?
Endomens, I'm sorry, I mispronounced it, endomens.
Oh, the endonym.
Yeah.
So I'm not an expert on what other communities want to call their language. So I encourage you to check with those respective communities, but I do know, for example, the Northern Chumash, Obispeño, refer to their language as Tilhini, the Ventureño. So these are endonyms, what the community members call their language. Julie Tumamite has told me that Mitskanakan is also a word for the Ventureño Chumash language, and Samala for the Inaseño language. But I encourage you to do research and contact the members of other communities as well. And then, of course, ours endonym that hopefully will be used more and more is Alap Kaswa. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I hadn't heard Alap Kaswa before, so that's neat. I took a picture of that. I want to remember it.
Cool, thanks. Good.
So, a lot of questions as you were talking about dialects. How many dialects are being worked on at present? Asks Charisse Cordero.
Yeah, the dialects are super interesting. I think there were many dialects before the arrival of the Spanish. So each, even like one village or group of villages. So for this area, for example, there were at least 2 dialects that come down to us. The dialects of the villages Micu and Cuyam, also known as Dos Pueblos. Also the Refugio dialect out at Gasil. So even in this small area, if you consider from from the area of Goleta, just going up the coast a little ways, having a different dialect, even as close as the area of Naples or Dos Pueblos today. And yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. There's not a lot of information. It's hard to reconstruct historically the different dialects that might have been spoken, but definitely this was seems to have been a very linguistically diverse area in terms of dialects. It's also difficult to, like, how do you define a dialect? It does have a kind of pejorative association, not like who wants their language to be considered a dialect, like a subgroup or subset of a larger, more important language. So yeah, there's also some questions about that, but thank you for your question. Hope that touched on some parts of it.
Yeah, and then Kevin Cannon and Cormac League both asked really about the mutual intelligibility between dialects. So how different do you know how different the languages were between up at Dos Pueblos and say Goleta? Could people talk to each other fairly easily?
It seems like, thank you for the question. It does seem like people around the time when we first start to get records, or like around the mission period, it seems like there was really I kind of get the sense that people were really like fluid or flexible with their language. So we're able to communicate in different languages or dialects. So people were not monolingual. They had capacity to speak several different languages. Like, for example, a Alapkaswa speaker could speak Ventureño, as my grandmother could. And maybe they knew words in Kawia, maybe they knew words in Yokuts. So it seems like that was very ordinary. And the idea of mutual intelligibility is super interesting, because, so for example, the Tilhini language, Obispeño, seems very, very different from the central Chumash languages, as we saw on the slide earlier. So I don't believe that Tilhini language was mutually intelligible with the central Chumash languages. But if you consider, for example, Samala and Alapkaswa, so those languages are very similar, actually. Still considered different languages, perhaps due to their phonological properties, especially, and maybe the morphology, but mutually intelligible to some extent, but also different enough. And then Mitskanakan Ventureño is a little bit more different than Samala, Inaseño, and Alakaswa. Thank you for your question. Great question.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and just ask this one because we have a lot of questions, James. And this is kind of basic that I think everyone should hear before anyone starts dropping off. First off, Julian Lynn says, thank you for a stunning presentation. What are your favorite resources to recommend for learning the local names of plants and places? Well, there is Jan Timbrook's book.
Definitely. Jan Timbrook's book is great. Let's see, for place, what was the other part, Ken? Plants and, was it place names?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's Richard Applegate has a really interesting book, Chumash Place Names. It's a pretty wide look at the whole territory across the whole region. I like even December's Child, you might be familiar with. There's a lot of place names in there. Let's see. Yeah, that's a really good question. I really like the place names. Yeah, the sources I go to are a little bit deeper than Yeah, but I think those are a good introduction. Like December's Child has a lot. Chumash Place Names by Richard Applegate, and then Jan Timbrook's book. If you want to, you can go into the Harrington notes, depending on the specific region or area that you'd like to investigate. And that's a much deeper dive as well.
Is that in the red book series that's at the museum?
Oh, I'm not familiar with that actually, Ken.
Oh, it's like 8-volume series on I think it's mostly from Harrington's information on the Chumash that is sold
Oh,
at the museum.
okay. Cool. That's another source for me to check out. Thank
Oh
you.
yeah, that one's huge.
Thanks, Ken.
Okay,
Great question.
go ahead. Done with that? Okay. Carolyn Cheney says, are the 6 languages of the Chumash family separate dialects, or do they have a common core? They were related to each other, right?
Sure. They're similar enough that they can be considered one language family. They're different enough to be considered different languages. Of course, how you define a language sometimes gets really sticky, but they do seem to be different enough to be defined as separate languages. I think also, yeah, that's a really good question. And I wonder if it also has to do with well, definitely has to do with the missions around which the people gathered in the historical period, and the accent or the dialect that became the prevailing standard dialect, which became probably the standard language. So I think that also has something to do with it. These missions as a central point. And then the languages then became different enough to be considered different languages. I hope that answered your question on that. Great question.
Yeah. Barbara Tejada wants to know what's the proper way to refer to multiples of items. So we put an S to make at the end of words to make them plural, but how was that done in the language?
Oh, thank you, Barbara, for that question. Yeah, that was a slide that didn't make the cut. I was considering, so how to make plurals, or even like distributive, like even in this picture we're looking at, like how would you say trees, or trees here and there, like distributed. So a tree is Bolton. So if you want to make it plural, Bolton, Bolton. So it's what's called reduplication. For example, the word star is akiwo, akiwo. To say stars, like more than one, akiwo. So you just take a part of the word and then put it in the front. There's many different rules to how you would do that, but it's called reduplication, and it's super interesting. So for example, one more example, the word bear, a bear is hoos. To say bears here and there, or multiple bears, it would be hoos, hoos. So really kind of an intuitive way to do it. Very efficient language.
Yeah, that's great. Barbara Boland, how many residents were on the reservation at the time of eviction?
Thank you for your question. I've heard that there was before, like at the peak time, before people started getting evicted, I heard there was it's either 600 or 800 families. I'm not sure exactly how many individuals. So possibly hundreds of people lived there during the peak time. At the very end, when people were being evicted, I believe it was less than a dozen people. Less than a dozen, yes.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Maureen McFadden, James, you mentioned your grandmother, Mary Lee Yee. She kind of goes into some detail here that I'm going to skip a little bit. Sorry. Who was still alive? Okay. Sorry. Do you know Nui Yi Chung's side of the family? Appreciate your class so very much. He mentions that she was friends with the Chung family of Jimmy's Oriental Garden fame. Do you know who those folks are?
Oh, sure. I know Barbara Chung. Um,
Uh-huh.
yes, and actually, my grandfather he worked in the kitchen. So my grandfather, so this was in the 1920s. So imagine Mary Yee, she was actually Caucasian and Alap Kaswa, Chumash. And then she married Henry Yee, who was he was Chinese, raised in a Chinese community. I'm not sure exactly where, possibly in Boston or in California. So yeah, can you imagine? So they weren't able to be married in the 1920s in California because of the immigration laws. They had to travel to Washington State to get married. But Henry Yee, my grandfather, worked in the kitchen of Jimmy's Orientals. So, great question. Thank you.
Okay, guys, I think we need to get close to wrapping up asking questions because I'm not keeping up with you. So we have a lot here still, James. So maybe we can try to get through these in a little more rapid fire fashion, although your answers are wonderful.
Sounds
The
good.
questions are wonderful.
Yes.
Kevin Cannon again. See, that's the thing is some of these people keep asking interesting questions over and over again.
Oh,
Were Chumash stories that were passed down in the native language translated to the current language that they were being shifted into? Well, I'm not sure if I understand that. Were
would you-
Chumash stories that were passed down in their native language or translated to the current language?
Most of them were translated. The ones that I've seen, most were translated into English, yes, or a few into Spanish, because Harrington was fluent in Spanish. Yes.
Oh, he was. I didn't know that. Okay. What a neat guy.
Very
Um,
idiosyncratic, very obsessive,
Yeah.
but very interesting.
Well, it's amazing. Somebody who, takes that on as a mission. That's just wonderful. Saving all these languages, recording them. Lori Ann Veltz, what are your future goals and ambitions with the Chumash language? That's a good question.
I like the language. This is my personal. Thank you, Lorianne. Thank you for the. I hope that the language can be passed down in homes from parents to children, from grandparents to children, and I hope it becomes very widespread. That's my modest goal. Thank you.
Somebody asked, and I can't find it here, but just since they're related, I'll just do it from memory. But any ideas of putting the native names on street lamps or street signs? I mean, and things like that. I mean, if you think of Europe, where you go to Wales or you go to Ireland or Scotland, the Gaelic is included in the on street signs. Wouldn't that be great?
Oh, how interesting. What an interesting thought. Yes,
Yeah.
that would be a project I'd be interested in taking on. Yeah, that would be really cool. They do it, I think, like in New Zealand, don't they do it with the Maori? Great idea. So the Northern Chumash, Tilhini, they've worked with Cal Poly and they've named some of their dorms with names in their language, which is really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, that is cool. A couple people asked about how can non-Chumash people as individuals help to revitalize the language?
Oh, interesting question. I think the best way is to because I think you sometimes have to be careful with with communities first of all, like, oh, do they want help? I think the best way is to become aware and supportive of the language that existed before and still exists now. And then, yeah, do research and find out about the language and tell other people about it within your sphere of influence. I think that's one of the best ways. Get out to events and where you can, I mean, there are events or places where you can meet Indigenous Native people and talk with them one-on-one and ask. But that's a great question. Thank you.
And Brian Troutwine asks, how will revitalizing your language preserve, restore, and perpetuate Barbareño Chumash culture?
Thanks, Brian, for the question. Yeah, there's such a strong connection between culture and language. I think you can get so far using English words to describe the cultural practices, but to use the original ancient language, you get to such a deeper level. It kind of, something activates in your consciousness. This is just me, not proven, but this is what I feel, that just touches a place where these cultural practices become just so much more meaningful, possibly authentic when you use the native language. Thank you, Brian. Great question.
I'll go ahead and skip to our last question, but I'm skipping over a bunch of others. But I think this is the last question, and it's a good one. Have you thought of asking OpenAI for a grant to add Chumash languages into GPT for use on the ChatGPT platform?
Thank you for that question. As yeah, one of my classes.
Everything's AI nowadays, you know. We gotta always slip that in.
In one of my classes, my classmate was looking for a Chumash language on ChatGPT. It wasn't there, and actually, ChatGPT knows a lot about language revitalization. We did a question. Yeah, I'm not sure. That would be something that the community would have to pretty much get a consensus agreement on, because there's a lot of issues. There's, these languages are really sensitive, and decisions about them, I always feel, should be community based, especially something like that. But it's an interesting prospect for the future. But thank you for that question. Thank you for all your questions and for staying till the end of this presentation.
We'll take maybe another 5 minutes.
Sure, I'm fine, Ken.
Let's do these rapid fire if we can. Are there any plans to start a language nest or immersion school so that there can be a new generation of first language speakers? Cormac asks.
Question. I don't feel we're at that level yet in terms of resources and human and financial, and but within within 5 years, quite possibly. Thank you.
Okay. And Hannah Weaver, what is the difference between Alapkaswa and, I guess is another place name you mentioned, it Smuwick?
Shmuich.
Yeah.
Shmuich. So another community in the Santa Barbara area refers to the language as Shmuich. I prefer Alapkaswa, and thank you, by the way, to Marianne Para for reinforcing my use of Alapkaswa. I prefer it because it's more closely associated with the village on which our reservation was located. Shmuich is more general, referring to the coastal areas. Thank you for your question.
Okay. How do you, Kevin Lorch wants to know, how do you connect to other native groups linguistically within the Chumash homeland and beyond? How do you network?
Oh, that's a very good question. We don't, I can say that we don't have very, very strong language-based ties. And yeah, that's a good question, like sharing of resources, or I don't think there's much cooperation, actually, not to disparage anyone. A lot of responsibility probably comes to me as well. I hope in the future there can be more cooperation. Yes, thank you.
Richard Klein wants to know, what is the best way to get information on language course offerings of Alapkaswa when they become available? Yeah, I'd like to know that myself.
I wonder if UCSB will ever have a course in that. I think it was taught in the 1970s by Madison Beeler, and maybe it has been taught since then. So I'm sure there'll be some amount of fanfare announcements when that comes up, maybe in the next 5 years, possibly. Thank you. Great question. There should be. Definitely.
Yes. So are there any resources to learn the language? Asked Tony Sportaro.
Oh,
There's really
Tony.
not like any books out there about the language. Not yet, anyway. Not until you write it, huh?
Yeah, really. For our particular community, Tony, I'm not aware of anything, and that's a super important question. I'm getting additional projects accumulating. Yeah, that's a great question. But yeah, I think it's something you have to do individual research on for now, and hopefully in the future these resources will become available. Yeah, there's so much to do. I wish I would have started 20 years ago, all of this, 30 years ago. What was I doing? Maybe surfing.
Yeah, right.
But trying to make up for a lot. Thank you for their question.
I like this question that Rachel Metz asked. Can you share a few words associated with sea life, the sea and sea life? Examples would be water, ocean, dolphin, alakoi, right? Alakoi is,
sure.
yeah, and sharks, etc.
Oh, okay. So ocean is Sachmin, SXA''min. Whale is Pahat, Paxat. Dolphin, yeah, Alokoi. Lobster, Woolawul. It kind of sounds like a language loan word to me, but
Yeah.
Salmon is Gowotch. So Kowwoch. I'm testing my ocean creatures knowledge. Oh, fish. Lilimu. So think of the island of Limu and Lilimu. Santa Cruz Island probably means like in the sea, Limu, possibly. Maybe. Hope that's enough. I like Lilimu. That's a good word.
Lokoi.
Alokoi, yes.
Good.
Great, nice pronunciation, Ken.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I should, because we have a CIR board member by that name. So a new one. Let's see. Well, somebody wants to know if, they can't personally do something to support you. Is there a way that you can support the work financially? There's another question about how did revitalization impact your life personally? And that's kind of it.
Okay.
For now.
Financial. Yeah, we've pretty much never, for language, we've really never accepted donations. I'm always real cautious about money. I know at some point to enlarge our program, we're going to have to. So I guess in the future, we'll have to establish the infrastructure for donations to accomplish the goals. And then Ken, what was the last? Oh, how has it impacted my life? Yeah, it's totally turned my life upside down. The last
In a
6
good way, I
years.
hope.
I came into it so innocent, like, oh, I'll just have a language class and it'll be easy. It'll be like teaching English as a second language, a foreign language. And little did I know. But thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you to all those who gave me a lot of support. I know some of you are on this still on Zoom. Thank you very much though. No,
Over 100.
Akinalin. Yeah.
Hung out to the bitter end. Well, thank you, James. Let's all give him a virtual round of applause. You can just hear it now. 109 people. 108 people. So thank you. That was fascinating. And these,
thank you.
again, as a reminder, you can find, oh, there's somebody's flashing some reaction and saying, thank you, fantastic. And
thank you very much.
So with that, we have to close it down for tonight, though, guys. And you can find this and all the other webinars that we've done archived on our website, cirweb.org/webinars. Thank you again, James Yee, for a very informative and interesting presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ken. Kiwatnan.